Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a story in the grim darkness of the far future that should not exist. A story that defies every rule carved into the bedrock of the galaxy, every doctrine written in the blood of martyrs, every instinct bred into bone and sinew across 60 million years of evolution. It is the story of an orc and a space marine who, against every conceivable odd, against every law of nature and the Imperium alike, formed something that can only be described as friendship. And if that sentence made you pause, if it made you tilt your head just slightly and wonder how such a thing could ever come to pass in a universe built upon the twin pillars of unending war and absolute hatred, then you are asking exactly the right question. Because to understand how an orc and a space marine could ever find common ground, we first need to understand just how vast the chasm between them truly is. We need to trace the origins of both species back through the millennia, yes, through the fog of legend and the ashes of forgotten wars, to the very forces that shaped them into what they are today. We need to understand what makes an orc, and what makes a space marine, and why the universe seems designed to ensure they will never, ever stop trying to kill each other. But the galaxy has a strange sense of humor, even in its darkest corners, in the places where hope goes to die, and faith is measured in the caliber of your ammunition. Yes, there are moments that catch you off guard, moments that remind you that even the most rigid systems, even the most unyielding ideologies, even the most ancient hatreds can crack just wide enough to let something unexpected slip through. And what slipped through in this case was something so profoundly unlikely that it has become one of the most fascinating and quietly beloved stories in all of Warhammer 40,000 lore. So settle in, because this is going to be a long one. We are going to journey across the stars, through the smoke of 1,000 battlefields, into the heart of what it means to be an orc, what it means to be a space marine, and what happens when two beings forged for nothing but war discover that the enemy standing across the battlefield might be the closest thing to a kindred spirit they will ever find. To appreciate the sheer impossibility of what we are about to discuss, you first need to understand the stakes. In the 41st millennium, as the galaxy is a charnel house, humanity clings to survival across 1,000,000 worlds, governed by a rotting theocratic empire that worships a half-dead god strapped to a golden throne. Every alien species is considered an abomination, a threat to be purged with fire and fury. Every deviation from orthodoxy is heresy. Every moment of peace is merely the calm before the next catastrophe. And in this universe, the orcs are humanity's oldest and most persistent enemy. As a race that has been fighting mankind since before the Imperium even existed, since before the Emperor walked among his people, since before the first bolt shell was ever fired. They are a species engineered for one purpose and one purpose alone: to wage war until the stars themselves burn out. The Space Marines, meanwhile, are humanity's answer to a galaxy that wants it dead. They are the Emperor's finest warriors, genetically enhanced super soldiers clad in power armor and armed with weapons that can level cities. They are trained from childhood to hate the alien, to despise the mutant, to destroy anything that threatens the sanctity of the human race. They do not negotiate with Xenos. They do not show mercy to the enemies of mankind. They are the hammer that falls upon the anvil of the galaxy's countless threats, and they have been doing this for 10,000 years without pause, without rest, but without doubt. So when I tell you that an orc and a space marine became friends, I need you to understand just how fundamentally, cosmically, absurdly impossible that should be. This is not a story about two neighbors who overcame a minor disagreement. This is a story about two beings from opposite ends of the existential spectrum, two creatures shaped by forces beyond their comprehension to be perfect enemies, as who somehow found something in each other that transcended the hatred built into their very DNA. And that is what makes it beautiful. That is what makes it one of the most compelling pieces of lore in the entire Warhammer 40,000 universe. Because in a setting defined by hopelessness, by the slow grinding death of everything good and decent, by the absolute certainty that things will only get worse. This one small, impossible friendship serves as a reminder that even in the grim darkness of the far future, the universe can still surprise you. But before we get to the friendship itself, we need to lay the groundwork. We need to go back, way back, to the very beginning of the orcs, to understand why they fight, why they live, why they are the way they are. We need to travel 60 million years into the past, to a war that shattered the galaxy and left scars that have never healed. Sure, we need to talk about the war in heaven and the ancient beings who created the orcs for a purpose so terrible and so grand that its echoes still reverberate through every corner of the galaxy today. The war in heaven. Even the name carries weight, does it not? It sounds like something out of a myth, a legend told around fires in the darkness of prehistory. And in many ways, that is exactly what it is. The war in heaven is the foundational conflict of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, and the primordial catastrophe from which everything else flows. It was fought 60 million years before the current era, between forces so powerful that their clash reshaped the fundamental nature of reality itself. On one side stood the Old Ones, an ancient reptilian species of immense psychic power and technological sophistication. They were the masters of the galaxy, the architects of countless younger races, the shepherds of life itself. On the other side stood the Necrontyre, a race of mortal beings cursed with short, painful lives, who had bargained away their very souls to the star-eating entities known as the Citan in exchange for bodies of living metal and the power to destroy their enemies. The Necrontyre became the Necrons, and the war that followed was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen or would ever see again. It was in the crucible of this conflict that the Old Ones created the Orcs, or rather, they created the Krork, of the ancient predecessors of the modern Orc race. The Krork were not the crude, bellowing greenskins we know today. They were something else entirely, something far more terrifying. Standing as tall as 12 meters in some cases, possessing technology that rivaled the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy, the Krork were biological weapons of staggering power, engineered from the ground up to serve as the Old Ones' frontline soldiers against the Necron menace. Yet they were designed to be resilient, to be aggressive, to be utterly fearless in the face of death. The Old Ones embedded within their genetic code everything they would need to fight and survive, from an instinctive knowledge of weapons and warfare to a unique psychic ability that would allow their ramshackle technology to function through the sheer force of collective belief. The Krork were, in every sense, a masterpiece of biological engineering. They were the ultimate soldiers, was created for the ultimate war. But wars end, even wars fought between gods. The war in heaven eventually burned itself out, leaving the galaxy shattered and the Old Ones extinct or vanished beyond all knowledge. The Necrons retreated into their tomb worlds, entering a slumber that would last for millions of years. The Aeldari, another creation of the Old Ones, rose to fill the vacuum of power, building a civilization of breathtaking beauty and terrifying decadence. And the Krork, left without their creators, without their purpose, without the war they had been designed to fight, began to change. Without the Old Ones to guide them, without a conflict vast enough to sustain the full flowering of their potential, the Krork slowly devolved. They became smaller, less intelligent, less technologically sophisticated. Over millions of years, through countless generations of fighting amongst themselves and against whatever enemies they could find, the Krork became the Orcs. But they lost the grandeur of their ancient forms, but retained the essential core of what the Old Ones had built into them. They retained the love of battle, the fungal biology that made them nearly impossible to eradicate, the gestalt psychic field that bent reality to their collective will, and the genetic knowledge that allowed even the most primitive orc to pick up a piece of scrap metal and turn it into something that could kill you. But this is the first thing you need to understand about the orcs. They are not merely a barbaric alien race. They are the degenerate remnants of a weapon system created by gods to fight in a war that ended 60 million years ago. Every time an orc picks up a chopper and charges screaming into the enemy, Every time a mech boy bolts together a vehicle from spare parts and wishful thinking. Every time a great green horde sweeps across a planet, leaving nothing but ruin in its wake. That they are fulfilling a purpose that was encoded into their very cells before the first human being ever drew breath. They are the galaxy's oldest soldiers, still fighting a war that their creators started and never finished. And they will continue fighting until the heat death of the universe itself. And they would not have it any other way. Because here is the second thing you need to understand about the orcs, and this is perhaps the most important thing of all. The orcs love it. They absolutely, unequivocally, wholeheartedly love fighting. It is not a burden to them. It is not a duty, or an obligation, or a necessary evil. It is the purest expression of joy they are capable of experiencing. When an orc charges into battle, bellowing at the top of his lungs with his chopper raised high and his bloodshot eyes blazing with excitement, he is experiencing the closest thing to spiritual fulfillment that his species can know. The orcs do not fight because they have to. Well, they fight because it is the best thing in the entire galaxy, and anyone who says otherwise simply has not been in a good enough fight yet. This fundamental love of combat shapes everything about orc society, from the way they organize their warbands to the way they build their technology, from the gods they worship to the currency they use. Orc society is brutally simple in its core philosophy. Might makes right. The biggest, strongest, most aggressive orc in any given group is the boss. And he stays the boss for exactly as long as no one, bigger, stronger, or more aggressive, comes along to take the position from him. There are no elections, no councils, no parliamentary procedures. If you want to be in charge, you punch the current boss in the face until he stops moving, and then you are in charge. If someone else wants to be in charge after that, they punch you in the face. It is democracy by violence. And it works perfectly for a species that considers a good headbutt to be the highest form of political discourse. But orc society is not quite as simple as it appears on the surface. Beneath the apparent chaos, there are structures and hierarchies that have persisted across millennia, cultural groupings that give the orc species a depth and variety that catches many observers off guard. These groupings are the orc clans, and understanding them is essential to understanding how an orc could ever form a bond with a space marine. Because not all orcs are created equal, and not all orcs think the same way, and the differences between the clans are where some of the most fascinating stories in the orc lore emerge. Now, let us talk about the orc mind. Not the individual orc mind, which is a fairly straightforward thing driven by aggression, hunger, and an insatiable desire for a good scrap, but the collective orc mind, the phenomenon that makes the orcs one of the most terrifying and baffling species in the entire galaxy, because the orcs possess something that no other species in Warhammer 40,000 has anything quite like. They possess a gestalt psychic field, a collective unconscious that links every orc to every other orc in a web of shared belief and communal power. This field is generated by every single orc all the time, whether they are aware of it or not. It grows stronger as more orcs gather in one place, as their excitement builds, as the anticipation of battle reaches a fever pitch, and it has the power to alter reality itself. This is not metaphor. This is not philosophical speculation. In the Warhammer 40,000 universe, the orc gestalt psychic field is a real, measurable phenomenon that has been studied, documented, and despaired over by the brightest minds of the Imperium. The basic principle is this: if enough orcs believe something is true, then it becomes true, not in a vague, symbolic sense, but in a concrete, physical, bullets actually coming out of the gun sense. An orc weapon that should not function by any known principle of physics will fire perfectly in the hands of an orc, because the orc believes it will fire, and the gestalt field makes that belief manifest. An orc vehicle painted red will actually go faster than an identical vehicle painted blue. Because every orc knows that red ones go faster. An orc explosive painted yellow will produce a bigger blast, because yellow is the color of big explosions. It sounds absurd. It sounds like the kind of thing that should not work in a universe that has rules and physics and logic. But the orcs do not care about your rules, and that is precisely what makes them so dangerous. The implications of this psychic field are staggering when you stop to think about them. And it means that orc technology is not really technology in any meaningful sense of the word. It is a physical manifestation of collective belief, a kind of unconscious psychic engineering that allows the orcs to build war machines and weapons from scraps of junk and the sheer force of their conviction that the junk will work. The Adeptus Mechanicus, the tech priests of the Imperium, who devote their entire lives to the understanding and maintenance of technology, have been driven to the brink of madness trying to understand how orc devices function. They have taken apart orc weapons and found nothing inside that should make them work. No proper mechanisms, no power sources, no logical arrangement of components. Just scrap metal, wire, and a vague sense that the universe has been bamboozled by a bunch of green-skinned lunatics who are too stubborn to accept that their guns should not shoot. Oh, but the gestalt field does more than just make orc technology work. It shapes the very fabric of orc society, creating a psychic feedback loop that reinforces the orc's most fundamental characteristics. The bigger and more powerful an orc becomes, the more the gestalt field responds to him, making him an even more effective leader and warrior. This is why orc war bosses grow physically larger the more orcs they lead. It is not just natural selection or better nutrition. It is the gestalt field itself recognizing the strongest orc and amplifying his power to match his status. The field wants there to be a boss because bosses lead to bigger fights, and bigger fights are what the field exists to facilitate. It is a self-reinforcing cycle of violence and growth that has been running without interruption for 60 million years. This psychic field also explains something that has puzzled Imperial scholars for centuries: the orcs' apparent lack of fear. Every intelligent species in the galaxy possesses some instinctive fear of death, a survival mechanism that keeps them from charging headlong into situations that will get them killed. Every species except the orcs. The current theory, supported by fragmentary records from the War in Heaven, is that when the Citan entity known as the Nightbringer rampaged across the galaxy during that ancient conflict, its passage imprinted a primal fear of death into the psyche of every intelligent species it encountered. The Aeldari fear it. Humans fear it. Even the Necrons, in their own cold, mechanical way, fear it. But the Krork, the orcs' ancestors, were apparently immune to this psychic imprinting. Whether this was because the Old Ones specifically designed them to be fearless, or because the Gestalt field protected them from the Nightbringer's influence, or because the Krork were simply too busy fighting to notice a cosmic horror passing through, nobody knows for certain. But the result is that modern orcs possess absolutely no instinctive fear of death. They are not brave in the way that a human is brave, overcoming their fear through courage and determination. They simply do not feel fear at all. Death is not a scary thing to an orc. It is, at worst, mildly inconvenient. And at best, it means you went out in the middle of a really good fight, or which is basically the orc equivalent of dying in your sleep, surrounded by loved ones. This fearlessness, combined with the Gestalt field's reality-warping properties and the orc's prodigious physical toughness, makes them one of the most dangerous species in the galaxy. An individual orc is a formidable opponent, standing as tall as a large human man, but far more heavily muscled, with thick green skin that can shrug off wounds that would kill a normal person several times over. Orc physiology is a marvel of biological engineering, a hybrid of animal and fungal characteristics that gives them incredible resilience and regenerative ability. They can survive the loss of limbs, the removal of organs, and injuries that would be immediately fatal to any other species. There are documented cases of orcs having their heads completely severed from their bodies and being successfully reattached by an orc pain boy, the greenskin equivalent of a surgeon, i.e. whose medical philosophy can be summarized as, more stitches is always better, and if the patient screams, that means he is still alive, which is a good sign. But an individual orc, dangerous as he is not what keeps Imperial generals awake at night. What keeps them awake is what happens when orcs gather in large numbers. Because when enough orcs congregate in one place, When the gestalt field reaches a critical threshold of power, something extraordinary happens. But the orcs begin to organize themselves into a massive crusade, a galaxy-shaking event of such destructive potential that it has its own name in the orc language. They call it a Great Green Crusade, a massive tide of destruction that sweeps across star systems like a living tsunami, destroying everything in its path and absorbing everything that survives into its ever-growing mass. These crusades are part holy war, part migration, part pub crawl, and entirely terrifying. They can last for years, decades, even centuries, and the amount of destruction they leave in their wake is almost beyond comprehension. At the head of every great crusade is a war boss, the biggest, meanest, most cunning orc in the horde. The war boss does not become the leader through any democratic process or hereditary right. He becomes the leader by being the orc that nobody else can beat in a fight. And as the crusade grows, as more and more orcs flock to his banner, drawn by the rising tide of the gestalt field, the war boss himself grows. He becomes physically larger, stronger, tougher, more intelligent. The gestalt field pours its energy into him, shaping him into a walking embodiment of orc dominance. The most powerful war bosses can grow to truly monstrous proportions, towering over even the largest of their followers, clad in armor made from the wreckage of enemy tanks and wielding weapons that could fell a building with a single swing. Now let us turn our attention to the other half of this impossible equation. Let us talk about the Space Marines, because to understand why a friendship between an orc and a Space Marine is so remarkable, you need to understand what a Space Marine actually is. Not just the simplified version, the big guy in the power armor with the cool gun, but the full, detailed, deeply unsettling truth of what it means to be one of the Emperor's Adeptus Astartes. A Space Marine begins his existence as a human being, usually a young man, often taken from the most brutal and unforgiving worlds in the Imperium, places where life is short, violence is constant, and only the strongest survive to see adulthood. These worlds are specifically chosen because the harshness of their environments produces the kind of resilient, aggressive, adaptable individuals that the Space Marine recruitment process requires. The boys who are selected, and they are always boys, and always young, usually between 10 and 14 years of age, are subjected to a series of trials designed to test every aspect of their physical and mental capabilities. The mortality rate during these trials is staggering. For every aspirant who passes, dozens die or are crippled beyond recovery. Those who survive the initial trials are then subjected to the single most extreme body modification procedure in the Imperium of Man. Over the course of several years, then they are implanted with 19 genetically engineered organs, each one designed to transform their bodies from ordinary human to something far beyond human. The process is agonizing, dangerous, and irreversible. The organs are grown from genetic material called gene seed, which is derived from the DNA of the Primarchs, the 20 demigod sons of the Emperor, who were the original templates for the Space Marine legions. Each Space Marine chapter carries the gene seed of its founding Primarch, and this genetic heritage shapes everything about the chapter, from its physical characteristics to its cultural traditions, to its unique quirks and flaws. The implantation process is a symphony of controlled mutation. A secondary heart is implanted, allowing the Marine to survive the destruction of his primary heart. A bone-strengthening organ causes the skeleton to fuse and harden until the Marine's ribcage becomes a solid plate of interlocking bone, strong enough to stop a bullet. As a third lung is added, allowing the Marine to breathe in toxic atmospheres and even survive the vacuum of space for limited periods. Glands that allow the Marine to spit corrosive acid, to enter a state of suspended animation, to learn by eating the brain matter of the dead. All of these are implanted during the long, painful years of transformation. But the most important implant, the one that truly defines a Space Marine, is the black carapace. This is a layer of synthetic material that is grafted directly onto the Marine's nervous system, fusing with his body and becoming a permanent part of his anatomy. The black carapace allows the Marine to interface directly with his power armor, controlling it not as an external garment, but as an extension of his own body. When a space marine puts on his armor, he does not wear it in the way that a human wears a suit of clothes. He becomes it. The armor's sensors feed directly into his nervous system. Its servos respond to his thoughts as naturally as his own muscles. Its weapons become extensions of his will. A fully armored space marine is not a man in a suit. He is a walking weapons platform, a fusion of flesh and ceramite and adamantium that represents the pinnacle of human martial capability. But the physical transformation is only part of what makes a space marine. The mental conditioning is equally important, and arguably even more profound. Throughout the implantation process and beyond, the aspirant is subjected to intense psychological programming, hypnotherapy, chemical conditioning, memory modification, and relentless indoctrination are used to reshape the aspirant's mind, burning away doubt, fear, compassion for the enemy, and any other emotional response that might interfere with his effectiveness as a warrior. By the time the process is complete, and the young man who entered the chapter's fortress monastery is gone, replaced by something that is no longer entirely human, a space marine thinks differently from a normal person. He perceives the world through a lens of threat assessment and tactical analysis. He does not feel fear, not because he has learned to overcome it, but because the chemical and psychological conditioning has literally removed his capacity for it. He does not feel pity for the enemy, but because pity has been burned out of his psyche like a cancer. He is loyal to his chapter, to his battle brothers, and to the Emperor. And beyond those loyalties, the emotional landscape of a space marine is a barren wasteland where human feelings go to die. This is crucial to understanding why a friendship with an orc should be impossible. Space marines are not just trained to hate aliens, they are engineered to hate them. The hatred of the Xenos is built into their very psychology, or reinforced through years of conditioning and centuries of tradition. The Imperium of man's official doctrine on alien species is simple and absolute. Suffer not the alien to live. This is not a suggestion. It is not a guideline to be interpreted flexibly based on circumstances. It is a commandment, as fundamental to the imperial worldview as the worship of the Emperor himself. Every Space Marine chapter, from the Ultramarines to the Space Wolves, from the Blood Angels to the Iron Hands, operates under this doctrine. Aliens are the enemy. Aliens are to be destroyed. There is no room for nuance, no space for understanding, no possibility of coexistence. The universe is humanity's birthright, and everything else is a trespasser to be removed with extreme prejudice. Consider for a moment the sheer weight of institutional hatred that exists within the Imperium. Our 10,000 years of warfare against alien species have produced a culture so deeply xenophobic that the very concept of an alien having value, of an alien deserving anything other than destruction, is literally unthinkable to most imperial citizens. Children are raised on stories of alien atrocities. Schools teach that the Xenos is the enemy of all human life. The Imperial Creed, the state religion that governs every aspect of life within the Imperium, explicitly identifies aliens as abominations in the eyes of the Emperor. To show mercy to an alien, to express curiosity about an alien culture, to suggest that coexistence might be preferable to genocide, these are not merely unpopular opinions within the Imperium. They are heresy, punishable by death or worse. The entire machinery of imperial civilization is geared toward the production and maintenance of hatred, and it has been operating at full capacity for 100 centuries. Our Space Marines exist at the apex of this culture of hatred. They are the embodiment of the imperial doctrine of xenocide, the living weapons that the Imperium points at its alien enemies, with the expectation that those enemies will be destroyed utterly and without mercy. A Space Marine does not question whether the alien deserves to live. He does not wonder whether there might be a peaceful solution to the conflict. But he does not experience doubt or hesitation or moral complexity when faced with a Xenos threat. He simply kills with the same mechanical efficiency and emotional detachment that he brings to every aspect of his existence. The alien is the enemy. The enemy must be destroyed, and that is the beginning and the end of the matter. But the universe has a way of testing even the most rigid beliefs, of finding the cracks in even the strongest armor, and of forcing even the most certain individuals to confront the possibility that the world is more complicated than their ideology would have them believe. And it is in those cracks, in those moments of uncertainty and confrontation, that the most interesting stories emerge. Let me tell you about the Space Marine chapters that have, in various ways and to various degrees, demonstrated that the doctrine of absolute hatred is not as absolute as the Imperium would like to believe. The Space Wolves, the sons of Leman Russ, have always been something of an anomaly among the Astartes. They are fierce warriors, as deadly as any Space Marine chapter in the galaxy, but they retain a sense of honor and a connection to their human origins that many other chapters have lost. The Space Wolves have been known to protect civilian populations even when doing so was not tactically necessary, to show mercy to defeated enemies when the situation warranted it, and to openly disagree with the Inquisition when they believed the Inquisition was acting unjustly. They are not friends of the alien by any stretch of the imagination, but they possess a capacity for independent moral judgment that creates, at least in theory, the possibility of a more nuanced response to the Xenos than the standard kill-on-sight approach. The Salamanders are another chapter that stands apart from the norm. Founded by the Primarch Vulcan, who was raised among the human population of the volcanic world of Nocturne, the Salamanders have always placed a higher value on the lives of ordinary humans than most Space Marine chapters. They fight to protect, not just to destroy, and their relationship with the civilian populations they defend is characterized by a warmth and a genuine concern that is rare among the Astartes. While the Salamanders are as zealous in their hatred of the alien as any other chapter, their capacity for empathy and their strong sense of right and wrong suggest that under the right circumstances, even they might be capable of seeing an alien in a different light. These are subtle distinctions, and they should not be overstated. No Space Marine chapter has ever officially sanctioned any form of positive relationship with an alien species. The doctrine of xenocide remains the official policy of every chapter, and any Space Marine who openly advocated for cooperation with aliens would face censure, punishment, and possibly death. But the fact that these subtle distinctions exist at all, the fact that some chapters retain enough of their humanity to at least contemplate the possibility of nuance, is significant. It means that the monolithic wall of hatred that the Imperium presents to the galaxy is not quite as solid as it appears, but that there are individuals within even the most rigid institutions who are capable of independent thought, and that the capacity for connection, for recognition, for something that might, in the right circumstances, grow into something resembling friendship, has not been entirely extinguished. And yet, despite all of this, despite the genetic engineering and the psychological conditioning and the millennia of hatred and the absolute certainty that the alien is the enemy, there exists in the lore of Warhammer 40,000 a relationship between an orc and an agent of the Imperium that can only be described as friendship. A strange, twisted, violent friendship, to be sure, but a friendship nonetheless. And the story of how it came to be is one of the most fascinating tales in the entire setting. But before we get to the specifics of that relationship, we need to understand the cultural context on the orc side. Because just as Space Marines are engineered to hate aliens, orcs are engineered to fight everything. And while these two imperatives might seem like they would produce the same result, mutual annihilation, the reality is more complex than that. Because the orc approach to combat is fundamentally different from the human approach. And that difference is what creates the crack through which friendship can, improbably, squeeze. To a Space Marine, combat is duty. It is the purpose for which he was created, at the function he fulfills in the grand machinery of the Imperium. He does not enjoy it in the way that a normal person might enjoy a hobby or a sport. He does it because it is what he is, because the alternative is unthinkable, because the enemies of mankind must be destroyed, and he is the instrument of that destruction. There is a grim satisfaction in a job well done, a cold professional pride in victory, but these are not the same as joy. A space marine does not laugh on the battlefield, but he does not grin with excitement when the fighting starts. He is a weapon, and weapons do not feel pleasure. An orc, on the other hand, fights for the sheer, unbridled, unapologetic joy of it. An orc in combat is the happiest creature in the galaxy. He is doing the thing he loves most, the thing he was born to do, the thing that every fiber of his being craves, with an intensity that borders on the spiritual. When an orc charges into battle, he is not fulfilling a duty. No, he is having the time of his life. He is screaming with delight, swinging his chopper with wild abandon, laughing as enemy fire sparks off his crude armor, and generally behaving like a child at the world's most violent birthday party. This is not bravery. This is not fanaticism. This is pure, uncomplicated happiness. The happiness of a being doing exactly what it was designed to do, in exactly the way it was designed to do it. This difference in attitude toward combat is what creates the possibility of the relationship we are about to discuss. Because while a space marine sees an orc as a target to be eliminated, an orc sees a space marine as something much more interesting. He sees a worthy opponent. He sees someone who can actually put up a fight. And in the orc worldview, there is nothing more valuable, nothing more precious, nothing more worthy of respect than a really, really good fight. Whilst the orc clans are the cultural groupings that divide the orc species into distinct subcultures, each with its own traditions, values, and approach to warfare. There are 6 major clans that are found across the galaxy. And while individual orcs can belong to any clan regardless of where they were spawned, the clan identity runs deep, shaping how an orc fights, how he dresses, what he values, and how he interacts with the rest of the galaxy. The Goths are the biggest, toughest, and most aggressive of all the orc clans. They are the embodiment of the orc ideal, the purest expression of the greenskin love of violence. Goths favor close combat above all else, dismissing ranged weapons as the tools of weaklings who are afraid to get their hands dirty. Their colors are black and white, typically arranged in a bold checkered pattern, and they have a tendency to produce the largest orcs and the most powerful war bosses. If you imagine the archetypal orc as the hulking green monster charging at you with a massive axe and a blood-curdling battle cry, you are probably imagining a Goth. The evil sons are the speed-obsessed gearheads of orc society, a clan devoted to going as fast as possible and making as much noise as doing it. They paint their vehicles and their armor a bright, aggressive red, because every orc knows that red ones go faster. And thanks to the gestalt field, they actually do. The evil sons field more vehicles than any other clan, from ramshackle bikes to smoke-belching trucks to heavily armored battle wagons, and their approach to warfare can be summarized in 3 words: fast, loud, and explodey. The Bad Moons are the wealthiest clan, distinguished by the peculiar biological quirk that their teeth grow faster than those of any other orc. Since orc society uses teeth as currency, the teeth of a greenskin being as good as gold in their economy, this makes the Bad Moons the richest orcs around. They are flashy and ostentatious, favoring gold and yellow colors and the biggest, shiniest guns they can get their hands on. They are the closest thing the orcs have to a merchant class, always buying, selling, trading, and showing off their wealth with the subtlety of a nuclear detonation. The Death Skulls are the looters, the scavengers, the light-fingered kleptomaniacs of orc society. They believe that the color blue brings good luck. And they paint themselves and their equipment in various shades of blue accordingly. Their approach to warfare is simple: fight the enemy, win the fight, and then steal absolutely everything that is not nailed down. And if it is nailed down, steal the nails too. Other orcs regard the Death Skulls with a mixture of grudging respect and intense irritation, because while their luck does seem to be genuinely better than average, thanks to the Gestalt field responding to their belief in the power of blue, they will steal from friend and foe alike with equal enthusiasm. The Snakebites are the traditionalists, the orcs who prefer the old ways and regard modern technology with suspicion and disdain. They favor a more primitive approach to warfare, relying on crude melee weapons, trained war beasts, and the raw physical power of the orc body, rather than the flashy gadgets and vehicles favored by other clans.
Honestly, this is the part of the lore that made me follow with this story in the first place. When I first read about Gazgakul letting Yaric go, I had to put the book down for a second, because it hit me that Games Workshop, whether they meant it or not, wrote one of the most emotionally complex relationships in all of sci-fi and buried it inside the faction that everyone treats as comic relief. The orcs are supposed to be the funny ones, right? The goofy green guys who paint things red and talk like football hooligans. But this relationship between Gazgakul and Yaric, there's nothing funny about it. It is genuinely moving, and I think the reason it works so well is because it doesn't try to be a feel-good story. Nobody hugs, nobody shakes hands, and nobody learns a lesson about tolerance. It's just two warriors who see each other clearly, and that's enough. That's the whole thing, and I don't know about you, but I found that way more powerful than any conventional friendship arc could ever be. But anyways, that's just my 2 cents. Let's go back to the video.
And they are covered in tribal markings, wear the pelts and hides of creatures they have hunted, and generally look like they belong in a prehistoric epic rather than a science fiction setting. Among the clans, the snakebites have the highest concentration of weird boys, the orc equivalent of psychic seers, which may be connected to their more spiritually oriented worldview. And then there is another layer to orc society that many observers miss entirely. A layer that gives the orcs a functional civilization, despite their seemingly anarchic nature. These are the odd boys, orcs who are born with innate talents in specific fields that make them indispensable to the functioning of orc society. The mech boys, or mechs, are born with an instinctive understanding of technology. They do not learn engineering in schools, or study blueprints, or attend lectures on mechanical theory. They simply know how machines work, share the knowledge encoded in their DNA by the old ones 60 million years ago. A mech can look at a pile of scrap metal and immediately see the potential within it, the gun that could be built from these pieces, the vehicle that could be assembled from those parts, the weapon of devastating power that is lurking inside what, to anyone else, would look like a heap of garbage. The most talented mechs, the big mechs, can build war machines of staggering complexity and destructive power, or from the hulking death dreads that stomp across battlefields, crushing everything in their path, to the titanic gargants that serve as walking effigies of the orc gods, Gork and Mork. Then there are the pain boys, the orc equivalent of doctors, though calling them doctors is perhaps the most generous use of that word in the entire galaxy. Pain boys are born with an instinctive understanding of orc anatomy, which they use to perform surgeries of breathtaking brutality and questionable medical necessity. A pain boy does not believe in anesthesia, sterile conditions, or the concept of doing no harm. He believes in sharp objects, loud screaming, and the firm conviction that if the patient survives the surgery, then the surgery was a success, regardless of how many extra limbs the patient now has, or how many organs were removed and replaced with bits of metal. Despite their methods, as pain boys are remarkably effective at keeping orcs alive and fighting, patching up wounds that would kill any other species with a combination of staples, glue, spare parts from recent casualties, and the occasional experimental procedure that the pain boy has been dying to try out on a willing, or more accurately, unconscious subject. The Runthards are specialists in the breeding and management of the smaller orcoid species, the Gretchen and Snotlings, who form the bottom rungs of orc society. The Gretchen, or Grots, are small, cowardly, and cunning creatures who serve as servants, laborers, ammunition carriers, living shields, and occasional snacks for their larger orc masters. They are used for every task that an orc considers beneath his dignity, which is to say, almost everything that does not involve fighting. Grots clean weapons, cook food, maintain camps, operate gun emplacements, and perform the 1,000 small, thankless tasks that keep an orc warband functioning. They are also used as ammunition in certain weapons, most notably the shock attack gun, a device of terrifying ingenuity that teleports snotlings through a brief, horrifying trip through the warp before depositing them inside enemy armor and vehicles, where the traumatized little creatures proceed to bite, claw, and generally make a nuisance of themselves with the desperate energy of beings who have just had a very, very bad day. And then there is the orc economy, which is one of the most elegantly simple economic systems in the galaxy. Orcs use their own teeth as currency. Specifically, they use the large, tusk-like teeth that grow in their lower jaws, which they call teeth. This might sound primitive, but it is actually a system of remarkable sophistication that solves several problems that plague more advanced economies. First, the supply of teeth is naturally regulated. Orc teeth grow back continuously, like those of a shark, which means that every orc has a steady, reliable income, regardless of his social status. There is no unemployment in orc society, no poverty in the human sense, because every orc can literally grow his own money. Second, teeth degrade over time, which prevents hoarding. An orc cannot save his teeth for a rainy day because they will eventually crumble to dust, forcing him to spend them while they still have value. This keeps the orc economy in constant motion, us with goods and services flowing freely throughout the warband. Third, any orc who is big enough and mean enough can simply punch another orc in the face and take his teeth, which provides an alternative method of wealth redistribution that is perfectly in keeping with the orc philosophy of might makes right. It is, in its own way, the most perfectly balanced economy in the galaxy, and it has been functioning without interruption for millions of years. The orcs also have a spiritual life, crude as it might seem to outside observers. They worship two gods, Gork and Mork, who represent the two fundamental aspects of the orc psyche. Gork is brutal but cunning, the god who will punch you in the face while you are looking at him. Mork is cunning but brutal, the god who will punch you in the face while you are not looking at him. The difference between the two is a matter of intense theological debate among the orcs, a debate that frequently devolves into fistfights that can escalate into full-scale battles involving hundreds or even thousands of combatants. The orcs take their religion seriously, in their own way, and the will of Gork and Mork is interpreted by the Weird Boys, orc psychers, who channel the gestalt psychic energy of the green tide into devastating displays of power. A weird boy in the midst of a large orc horde becomes a conduit for the collective psychic energy of every orc around him, and the results can be spectacular and terrifying in equal measure, ranging from blasts of crackling green energy that can melt through tank armor to psychic shockwaves that scramble the minds of everyone in the vicinity, friend and foe alike. There is something almost admirable about the orcs. If you can look past the violence and the destruction and the fundamental incompatibility with everything else in the galaxy, they have achieved something that no other species has managed. They have created a society that is perfectly self-sustaining, perfectly adapted to its environment, and perfectly content with its lot in existence. Orcs do not suffer from existential angst. They do not question the meaning of life or wonder about their place in the cosmos. They know exactly what they are, they know exactly what they want, and they spend every waking moment pursuing it with an enthusiasm and a joy that is, frankly, enviable. In a galaxy full of species that are miserable, are conflicted, and consumed by doubt, the orcs are the one race that is having a genuinely good time. And there is something to be said for that, even if the good time in question involves a lot of screaming, a lot of explosions, and a truly unreasonable amount of green paint. All of this, the clans, the odd boys, the economy, the religion, the gestalt field, comes together to create a civilization that is far more complex and resilient than it appears on the surface. If the orcs are not mindless savages, they are a species with culture, with traditions, with a functional society that has been operating continuously for longer than any other civilization in the galaxy. They may not build beautiful cities, or compose symphonies or write poetry, but they have something that is, in its own brutal way, equally impressive. They have a civilization that is perfectly adapted to its purpose, a society that produces exactly what the orc species needs, which is more orcs, or more fights and more fun. Now, let us talk about the other side of this incredible equation. But first, let us talk about one particular cultural phenomenon among the orcs that is absolutely crucial to understanding how a friendship between an orc and a human could ever form. This is the concept of the freebooters, the pirate class of orc society. Freebooters are orcs who have left their clans, either voluntarily or through exile, and have taken to the stars as roving bands of mercenaries, and pirates and adventurers. They are the outcasts, the misfits, the orcs who do not fit neatly into the clan structure, but who are too tough, too cunning, or too stubborn to simply fade away. Freebooters model themselves on the great pirates of legend, sporting peg legs, hook hands, and enormous tricorn hats that would look absurd on anything that was not 7 feet tall, 300 pounds, and green. They roam the galaxy in rickety ships held together by the gestalt field, and not much else. They are looking for treasure, fights, and the kind of freedom that the rigid hierarchy of clan life does not provide. Freebooters, like the Blood Axes, have been known to work as mercenaries for non-orc factions, including the Imperium. Inquisitors and rogue traders, those imperial agents who operate in the grey areas of the law, have occasionally employed freebooter warbands for particularly dirty or dangerous jobs that they do not want to entrust to imperial forces. The arrangement is always precarious, always temporary, and always fraught with the possibility of betrayal from either side. But it works, after a fashion, because both parties get what they want. The freebooters get a fight and some loot, and the inquisitor or rogue trader gets a disposable force of alien muscle that can be pointed at a problem and trusted to solve it with maximum violence and minimum concern for collateral damage. And then there are the Blood Axes. The Blood Axes are the clan that makes this entire story possible, the cultural bridge between the orc species and the Imperium of man. Because the Blood Axes are, by orc standards, shockingly pragmatic. They were the first orc clan to encounter the forces of the Imperium, and through that long, violent acquaintance, they picked up habits and attitudes that other orcs find deeply unsettling. Blood Axes use camouflage. Blood Axes make tactical plans. Though Blood Axes will retreat from a battle they are losing, regroup, and come back with more warriors and a better strategy. And most controversial of all, Blood Axes will occasionally work alongside human forces as mercenaries, fighting for the Imperium in exchange for weapons, vehicles, and the thing that orcs value above all else, a good fight. This is the clan that changes everything, because the Blood Axe's willingness to interact with humans, to trade with them, to fight alongside them. He creates a cultural context in which an orc can see a human not just as prey or as an obstacle, but as a potential partner, a temporary ally, even a respected opponent. Other orc clans despise the Blood Axes for this. They call them treacherous, cowardly, and worst of all, unorky. But the Blood Axes do not care, because they have figured out something that the other clans have not. They have figured out that humans are actually pretty good fighters, and that working with them, even temporarily, it can lead to even bigger and better fights down the road. It is a pragmatism born not of weakness, but of cunning. The Blood Axe understanding that sometimes the best way to get what you want is to play the long game, to build relationships, to create alliances that serve your interests, even if they scandalize your peers. The Blood Axe's interaction with the Imperium is well documented in the lore. They have served as mercenaries for rogue traders, those freewheeling imperial explorers and merchants who operate beyond the normal bounds of imperial law. They have been contracted by inquisitors, the secretive agents of the emperor, who sometimes find that an expendable force of alien muscle is exactly what a delicate situation requires. They have traded openly with imperial worlds, exchanging raw materials and minerals for weapons and equipment that they then turn around and use against whoever they feel like fighting next. And it is a relationship built on mutual exploitation, a transactional arrangement in which both sides get something they want, while maintaining the fiction that they are not really friends. But here is the thing about relationships built on mutual exploitation. Sometimes, despite the best efforts of everyone involved, they develop into something more. Sometimes the rogue trader who hires a Blood Axe warband finds himself developing a grudging respect for the orc warboss who leads them. Sometimes the inquisitor who uses orc mercenaries to clear a space station discovers that the big green brute at the head of the mob has a sense of humor that catches him off guard. And sometimes, very rarely, in the most unlikely of circumstances, two beings from opposite sides of the galactic divide find in each other something that transcends the boundaries of species and ideology. Which brings us, at last, to the relationship that is the heart of this story, i.e. the relationship between Gazgakul mag Uruk Thraka and Commissar Sebastian Yaric. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Wait, Gazgakul and Yaric? Those are the orc and the space marine who became friends? And the answer is, well, sort of. The relationship between Gazgakul and Yaric is not friendship in the way that you or I might understand it. It does not involve dinner parties or gift exchanges or heartfelt conversations about feelings. It is something far stranger, a far more alien, and in many ways far more profound than conventional friendship. It is a relationship that operates according to rules that neither humans nor orcs fully understand, a bond forged in the fires of war that transcends the hatred that should define every interaction between their species. But let me clarify something first. Yaric is not technically a space marine. He is a commissar, a political officer of the Astra Militarum, the Imperial Guard. He is a baseline human, unenhanced by gene seed or power armor, armed with nothing but a bolt pistol, a power claw he ripped from a dead orc, and an iron will that would make a space marine envious. But in the eyes of the orcs, Yaric might as well be a space marine. He fights like one, he leads like one, and most importantly, he refuses to die like one. The orcs respect the space marines for their combat prowess, and they hold Commissar Yaric in even higher regard. Because while a space marine's courage comes from genetic engineering and psychological conditioning, Yaric's courage comes from pure, undiluted, unaugmented human stubbornness. He is brave not because someone rewired his brain to remove fear, but because he simply refuses to give in to it. And that, to an orc, is the most impressive thing in the galaxy. To understand the relationship between Gazgakul and Yaric, you first need to understand Gazgakul himself. Gazgakul mag Uruk Thraka is the most powerful and influential orc warlord of the current era, a towering figure of green-skinned menace whose shadow falls across entire sectors of the galaxy. He is a Goth, from the most warlike of all the orc clans, and he is driven by a vision that sets him apart from every other warboss in history. Gazgakul believes that he is the prophet of Gork and Mork, the twin gods of the orc race, and that he has been chosen to lead the greatest green crusade the galaxy has ever seen, a crusade that will engulf every star system, every planet, every species, until the entire universe is one glorious, never-ending battlefield. Gazgakul's origins are humble by orc standards. He started out as just another boy, one grunt among millions on the orc world of Urk. But his destiny changed forever when a bolt round from a Dark Angel space marine destroyed a significant portion of his skull. By all rights, this should have killed him. By any reasonable standard of biology, orc or otherwise, having a significant chunk of your brain blown away by a mass-reactive explosive projectile should end your participation in the game of life permanently. But Gazgakul is not reasonable, and the orc painboy, known as Mad Doc Grotznik, is even less so. Grotznik collected Gazgakul's broken body, hauled it back to his operating theatre, and performed what can only be described as the most aggressive piece of brain surgery in the history of medicine, replacing the missing portions of Gazgakul's skull with a hodgepodge of adamantite plates, wires, and pure orky determination. When Gazgakul woke up, he was different. The bullet and the subsequent surgery had done something to his brain, opening pathways that had been closed, activating portions of his consciousness that are normally dormant in modern orcs. He began to have visions, flashes of insight that he attributed to Gork and Mork, speaking directly to his mind. These visions told him that he was destined for greatness, that he would lead a crusade that would make all previous greenskin crusades look like playground squabbles. He killed the current war boss, took control of the warband, united the warring factions of Urk under his banner, and set out to conquer the galaxy with the terrifying conviction of someone who genuinely believes that God is on his side. His first major campaign was the Second War for Armageddon, a massive invasion of the imperial industrial world of Armageddon that would become one of the most famous conflicts in the entire history of Warhammer 40,000. Armageddon itself deserves a moment of attention because the planet is not just a random imperial world. It is one of the most strategically important industrial centers in the entire Imperium, a hive world of staggering productive capacity that supplies weapons, vehicles, and war material to imperial forces across multiple sectors. Losing Armageddon would not just be a military defeat. It would be an economic catastrophe, a blow to imperial logistics so severe that entire fronts could collapse from the resulting supply shortages. This is why, when Gazgakul set his sights on Armageddon, the Imperium responded with such desperate urgency. This was not a fight they could afford to lose. Gazgakul arrived in the Armageddon system aboard a space hulk, one of those massive conglomerations of ships and debris that drift through the warp like metallic tumors, occasionally vomiting themselves back into real space with whatever cargo of horrors they have accumulated during their journey. The space hulk was enormous, its bulk so vast that it registered on Imperial sensors as a small moon. When it translated into real space above Armageddon, the system's defenses, already outdated and undermanned, were overwhelmed almost immediately. The Orcs poured out of the hulk in a green avalanche, boarding craft and drop pods, and improvised landing vehicles cascading down through the atmosphere like a rain of rusted metal and mad ambition. The initial Imperial response was catastrophic. The planetary governor, a man named Hermann von Straub, was a political creature rather than a military one, and his handling of the crisis was a masterclass in incompetence. He refused to order a general mobilization, downplayed the severity of the threat, squabbled with military advisors who urged immediate defensive preparations, and generally behaved as though the largest Orc invasion in living memory was a minor inconvenience that would sort itself out if he just ignored it hard enough. By the time the reality of the situation penetrated von Straub's comfortable delusions, the Orcs had already established a massive beachhead and were advancing on the planet's primary hive cities with the unstoppable momentum of a green tsunami. Gazgakul descended upon the planet with a horde of Orcs so vast that it darkened the skies of the world, sweeping aside the initial Imperial defenses with contemptuous ease. Hive after hive fell to the green tide, their populations slaughtered or enslaved, their industries repurposed for the production of Orc war materiel. The situation was desperate. Multiple hive cities had already fallen. The planetary defense forces were in disarray, their leadership paralyzed by incompetence and infighting. Reinforcements were on their way, but they would take time to arrive, time that Armageddon did not have. It seemed as though nothing could stop the advance, as though Armageddon would be consumed completely. And then, Gazgakul came to Hades' hive, and at Hades' hive, he met Commissar Sebastian Yaric, and everything changed. Yaric was already a legend by the time Gazgakul arrived at his door. Born as Sebastian Varden on the world of Taos III, the young Yaric had known the horror of Orc invasion since childhood. His homeworld was attacked by greenskins when he was just a boy, and the experience of seeing his community destroyed, his neighbors slaughtered, and his entire world torn apart left scars that never fully healed. But they also forged something within him, a core of iron determination, a refusal to submit, a burning hatred of the Orc species that would fuel his career for decades to come. He was raised by his grandfather, a veteran sergeant of the Imperial Guard, who taught him to fight, to survive, to think tactically, and most importantly, to never, ever give up. When the Orcs came to his world, a young Yaric survived alone in the wilderness, laying traps, killing Gretchen, scavenging supplies, and generally making himself as much of a nuisance as a child can be to an invading army of alien fungus monsters. He was eventually found and inducted into the Schola Progenium, the imperial institution that raises orphans for service to the emperor. From there, he was trained as a commissar, or one of the political officers whose job is to maintain morale and discipline within the ranks of the Imperial Guard. Commissars are feared figures in the Imperial military, men and women with the legal authority to execute any soldier who shows cowardice, disobedience, or any other sign of wavering loyalty. They carry bolt pistols and chain swords, and they are expected to lead from the front, demonstrating by personal example the courage and dedication they demand from the troops under their supervision. It is a dangerous job because commissars are prime targets for enemy snipers. They are sometimes accidentally shot by their own men who resent their authority, and they are expected to be the last ones standing when everything else has fallen apart. Yaric was not just a good commissar. He was, by any measure, one of the greatest commissars the Imperium had ever produced. And he had spent decades fighting the enemies of the Emperor, earning a reputation as one of the most formidable and unyielding warriors in the Astra Militarum. He was not a space marine. He was not genetically enhanced. He did not wear power armor or carry weapons of terrifying destructive power. He was just a man, an old man by this point, with a bolt pistol, a commissar's cap, and an absolute refusal to accept defeat. But there was something about Yaric that went beyond his weapons and his authority. There was a quality to him, a force of personality, a sheer, bloody-minded stubbornness that elevated him above the ordinary run of military officers and placed him in a category usually reserved for the legendary figures of Imperial history. There is a story about Yaric that illustrates this quality perfectly. During the defense of Hades' hive, Yaric lost his arm in combat with an orc war boss, and any other officer would have been evacuated to the rear for medical treatment. Yaric did not even stop fighting. He took the power claw from the orc that had taken his arm, had it grafted onto the stump by a field surgeon, and went right back into the battle, now wielding the enemy's own weapon against his fellows. The orcs, who have a deep appreciation for this kind of behavior, were absolutely delighted. Here was a human who fought like an orc, who refused to acknowledge injury, who took a trophy from a fallen enemy and used it against his former owner's comrades. It was, from the orc perspective, the most orky thing a human had ever done, and it cemented Yaric's reputation among the greenskins as a warrior of extraordinary caliber. The legend grew from there. The orcs began to believe that Yaric could kill with a look, that his gaze could strike an orc dead on the spot. This was, of course, not true, but the gestalt field, that marvelous, a terrifying phenomenon that makes orc beliefs manifest in reality, took this widespread greenskin superstition and did something remarkable with it. Yaric eventually acquired a bionics replacement for one of his eyes, a cybernetic implant that happened to glow with an eerie red light. And the orcs, who had been telling each other for years that Yaric could kill with a look, saw that glowing red eye and felt, deep in their fungal bones, a genuine stab of fear. Where the gestalt field had partially fulfilled their own belief. Yaric could not actually kill with a look, but the orc belief that he could made them hesitate, flinch, lose that fraction of a second of confidence that, in the heat of combat, can mean the difference between life and death. Yaric had become, through the power of orc superstition, something more than human in the eyes of the greenskins, a figure of almost mythological terror that haunted their collective consciousness like a nightmare that refused to end. When the orc horde came to Hades' hive, Yaric stood in its path and said no. Not today, not here, not while I am breathing. For 6 months, Yaric held Hades' hive against the full fury of the orc invasion. 6 months of constant, relentless, grinding warfare during which the defenders were outnumbered, outgunned, and slowly running out of everything. Ammunition, food, medical supplies, hope. Yaric held them together through sheer force of will, striding through the ruins of his city with his power claw crackling and his eyes blazing, shooting anyone who tried to run and personally leading counterattacks against any orc breakthrough. The legend grew. The soldiers of Hades' hive began to whisper that Yaric could not be killed, that he was blessed by the Emperor himself, that so long as he stood, the hive would stand. And then something extraordinary happened. The orcs heard the rumors. The orcs, those crude, bellowing, green-skinned barbarians who were not supposed to care about anything except fighting, heard the stories about this human who would not die, this old man who stood against their entire horde and refused to bend, and they were impressed. More than impressed. They were fascinated. Because the orcs had a name for someone like Yaric, and someone who fought with such ferocity and such stubbornness that killing them would actually be a waste. They called such a person a scumrod, and scumrod is the closest word in the orc language to friend, though it does not mean friend in the way that you and I would understand it. A scumrod is a favorite enemy, someone who fights so well and so entertainingly that the orc cannot bring himself to kill them, because doing so would mean losing the best fight he has ever had. As a scumrod is someone you keep alive specifically so you can fight them again tomorrow. This is the key to understanding the Gazgakul-Yaric relationship, and it is the key to understanding the broader concept of orc friendship with non-orcs. An orc does not form bonds of affection in the human sense. He does not develop emotional attachments based on shared experiences or mutual understanding. What he develops is something that might be called combat intimacy, a deep, almost reverent appreciation for an opponent who can push him to his limits, who can match his ferocity blow for blow, who can make every fight a challenge worth savoring. In the orc worldview, there is no greater compliment you can pay someone than to say, "That one is too good to kill." It means they have transcended the category of mere enemy and entered a rarefied space where the joy of the fight itself outweighs the satisfaction of the kill. Gazgakul came to see Yaric as his scumrod, while his favorite enemy, the one opponent in the galaxy who could give him a fight worth having. He directed the bulk of his forces at Hades' hive specifically because Yaric was there, because fighting Yaric was more fun than fighting anyone else on the planet. He poured resources and warriors into the assault on the hive, not because it was strategically important, though it was, but because the challenge of breaking Yaric's defense was the greatest entertainment he had ever experienced. At the siege of Hades' hive was not just a military operation for Gazgakul. It was the culmination of a personal obsession, a duel between two titans played out across the scorched and bloody streets of a dying city. In the end, the hive fell. It had to fall, eventually. No defense, no matter how heroic, can hold forever against the kind of numbers the orcs can bring to bear. But the time Yaric had bought was enough. His defense of Hades' hive tied up a massive portion of Gazgakul's forces for half a year, distracting the war boss from his broader strategic objectives and giving the Imperium time to muster reinforcements. When Commander Dante of the Blood Angels Space Marine chapter arrived with his forces, the counterattack was devastating. The orcs were driven back. Gazgakul was forced to retreat from Armageddon, and the planet was saved, at least temporarily. Yaric was one of the few survivors of the final battle for Hades' hive, and it took months for him to recover from his injuries. But the story does not end there. Because Gazgakul, unlike most orc war bosses who would simply move on to the next fight without a backward glance, could not stop thinking about Yaric. The old Commissar had gotten under his skin in a way that no opponent ever had before. Years later, when Yaric tracked Gazgakul to the planet Golgotha in an attempt to finish what they had started on Armageddon, the war boss turned the tables. It was a trap. Gazgakul captured Yaric, and what he did next is what transforms this from a simple story of military rivalry into something much more strange and much more wonderful. He did not kill him. Any other orc, any other war boss in the galaxy would have killed Yaric on the spot, or worse, tortured him to death for the amusement of the boys. But Gazgakul did neither of these things. Instead, he kept Yaric alive. He spoke to him, after a fashion, in the rough, guttural pidgin that passes for cross-species communication between orcs and humans. He told Yaric about his plans, about the great crusade he was building, about the wars that were coming. And then, after weeks of captivity, he let Yaric go. Let that sink in for a moment. The most powerful orc warlord in the galaxy captured his greatest enemy and then released him. He sent Yaric back to the Imperium with a message, spoken in the simple, direct language that orcs use for the things that matter most. He told Yaric to go home, to prepare his defenses, to get ready, because Gazgakul was coming back to Armageddon, and when he did, he wanted Yaric to be there waiting for him. He wanted the fight to be as good as possible. He wanted his scumrod to be at his best when they met again, because anything less would be a waste of what they had built together. This is, in the context of orc psychology, the greatest act of respect one being can show another. Gazgakul did not release Yaric out of mercy or compassion or any human emotion. He released him because Yaric was too valuable to waste, too good a fighter to throw away on a quick death, too important to the quality of future fights to eliminate prematurely. Yet in orc terms, this is an act of profound wisdom, a recognition that the long-term joy of a rivalry maintained is worth more than the short-term satisfaction of a kill achieved. Gazgakul was investing in his own future happiness, ensuring that the greatest fight of his life was yet to come, and Yaric, for his part, understood what had happened. He understood it in a way that no other Imperial officer could, because he had spent more time fighting orcs than almost any human alive. And he had developed an intuitive grasp of the orc psyche that went beyond anything in the official intelligence briefings. He knew that Gazgakul's decision to release him was not a sign of weakness or confusion. It was a sign that the war boss saw him as something more than a mere enemy. It was a sign of respect, expressed in the only language the orcs understand, the language of war. When Gazgakul returned to Armageddon for the Third War, Yaric was there. Yet he had done exactly what Gazgakul had asked. He had prepared the defenses, trained the troops, fortified the positions. He had turned Armageddon into the hardest target in the Imperium, not just because it was his duty, but because some part of him, some small, deeply buried part that no commissar would ever openly acknowledge, wanted the fight to be worthy of what had passed between them. He wanted to give Gazgakul the challenge he had been promised. Yet because to do otherwise would have been to dishonor the strange, impossible bond that had formed between them. The preparations for the Third War were unlike anything Armageddon had seen before. Yaric, drawing on every lesson he had learned during the Second War, transformed the planet's defenses from a loosely coordinated collection of local garrisons into a meticulously planned defensive network. He drilled the Armageddon Steel Legion, the planet's premier military regiment, until they could respond to an orc assault in their sleep. He positioned anti-aircraft batteries to create overlapping fields of fire that would turn any landing approach into a corridor of death. He fortified the hive cities with such thoroughness that each one became a self-contained fortress, capable of holding out independently even if surrounded on all sides by the green tide. But Yaric was not just preparing a defense, he was preparing a fight. And there is a difference between those two things that is subtle but important. A defense is designed to survive. A fight is designed to challenge. Yaric wanted Gazgakul to have to earn every inch of ground, to pay for every advance in green blood, to face a resistance so fierce and so intelligent that the war boss would be forced to bring his very best to the battlefield. It was, in its own way, a gift. The only gift that a commissar could give to an orc, and the only gift that an orc would want to receive. A proper fight, and Yaric was not alone in this preparation. The Imperium, recognizing the scale of the coming threat, dispatched reinforcements on a massive scale. Multiple Space Marine chapters sent forces to Armageddon, including the Black Templars, the Salamanders, and the Blood Angels. Entire regiments of Imperial Guard were redeployed from other war zones to bolster the planet's defenses. Titan legions, those walking god machines of unimaginable destructive power, were committed to the defense. The Inquisition established a presence on the planet, bringing with them the shadowy resources of that most secretive of imperial institutions. Armageddon was being prepared not just as a fortress, but as a killing ground, a place where the full might of the Imperium of man could be brought to bear against the greatest orc invasion in living memory. When Gazgakul arrived, he did not come alone either. And 57 years to the day after launching the Second War, the war boss returned to the Armageddon system with a horde that dwarfed his previous invasion. Millions upon millions of orcs, drawn from dozens of tribes and warbands across the galaxy, all united under the banner of the self-proclaimed prophet of Gork and Mork. The space above Armageddon was choked with orc vessels. From the massive space hulks that served as the horde's capital ships, to the countless smaller craft that buzzed around them like green insects. When the invasion began in earnest, it was like nothing the planet had ever experienced. A tidal wave of violence that crashed against Yaric's carefully prepared defenses with the force of an orbital bombardment. The Third War for Armageddon was the largest orc invasion in recorded Imperial history, and a conflict so vast and so devastating that its repercussions are still being felt across the galaxy. Gazgakul brought a horde of such size that the skies over Armageddon turned green with the sheer number of dropships and landing craft descending upon the planet. The fighting was apocalyptic, a grinding, city-by-city, street-by-street battle that consumed millions of lives on both sides. And through it all, as the rivalry between Gazgakul and Yaric burned at the heart of the conflict like a signal fire, drawing both commanders toward each other with the gravitational inevitability of colliding stars. But here is where the story takes its most fascinating turn. After months of fighting, after the initial orc advance was blunted and the conflict settled into a brutal stalemate, Gazgakul grew bored. A stalemate, by definition, is not a good fight. It is a fight that has stopped being fun. It's a fight where neither side can gain the upper hand, where every day is the same grinding, joyless attrition. And for an orc, especially for an orc of Gazgakul's vision and ambition, a boring fight is worse than no fight at all. So Gazgakul did something that shocked the Imperium and baffled his own followers. He left. He took his personal warband and departed Armageddon, leaving the settlement of the conflict to his subordinates, heading off into the galaxy in search of new fights, new challenges, new opportunities to test himself against worthy opponents. And Yaric followed him. The old Commissar, now well past the age when most humans have retired or died, vowed that he would not rest until Gazgakul was destroyed. He set out in pursuit of his nemesis, joined by High Marshal Helbrecht of the Black Templars Space Marine chapter, who had his own score to settle with the Orc warlord. Together, they led a ragtag fleet of Imperial warships across the stars, and chasing the ghost of the greatest Orc warlord the galaxy had ever known. It was a pursuit that lasted years, spanning dozens of star systems and countless minor engagements, a game of cat and mouse played out against the backdrop of a galaxy at war. The chase took them through some of the most dangerous regions of the galaxy. They tracked Gazgakul through the Haunted Gulf, a region of space notorious for its warp instability and the disappearance of entire fleets. They followed rumors and intelligence reports across sectors, always one step behind, always arriving just too late to catch the war boss, but always finding evidence of his passage. The smoldering ruins of worlds he had attacked, the debris fields of fleets he had destroyed, the scattered survivors of encounters with his forces, who spoke of the terrifying green tide in hushed, traumatized whispers. For Yaric, the pursuit was more than a military operation. It was personal, in a way that no military operation should be, and he knew it, even if he would never admit it to anyone, least of all himself. He told himself and anyone who asked that he was pursuing Gazgakul because the war boss was a threat to the Imperium that needed to be neutralized. He told himself that it was his duty as a servant of the Emperor to hunt down the alien menace and destroy it. And all of that was true as far as it went. But there was something else driving him, and something that lived in the spaces between the official justifications, something that he could feel but could not name. It was the pull of the scumrod bond, felt from the other side. Yaric was drawn to Gazgakul, not just as a hunter is drawn to prey, but as a dancer is drawn to a partner, as a musician is drawn to a counter-melody, as a storyteller is drawn to the only audience that truly understands the tale being told. And the two of them were locked in a narrative that neither could escape, and, if they were being honest, neither wanted to escape. Gazgakul ran, and Yaric chased, and the running and the chasing were themselves the point, were themselves the relationship, were themselves the expression of a bond that had no name in any human language but was as real and as powerful as gravity. Just when it seemed that Yaric might finally corner his quarry in the Haunted Gulf, Gazgakul's flagship, the massive orc vessel known as the Kill Wrecker, disappeared in a blaze of green energy, teleported through the warp by unknown means to emerge in the Octarius sector, where a massive war was already raging between orcs and the Tyranids of Hive Fleet Leviathan. Even there, in the midst of fighting an entirely different enemy, Gazgakul demonstrated the same qualities that had drawn Yaric to him in the first place. He took charge of the local orc forces, unorganized them into a coherent fighting force, and proceeded to wage a war against the Tyranids that was simultaneously brilliant and insane. At one point, Gazgakul was actually swallowed whole by a massive Tyranid bioform called a Morlock, and the war boss simply tore his way out from the inside, emerging covered in alien viscera and bellowing his war cry at the top of his considerable lungs. It is the kind of thing that should not be possible. That's the kind of thing that defies every law of biology and physics and common sense. But for Gazgakul, it was just another Tuesday. Think about what this means. A human commissar, a man sworn to the destruction of all Xenos, a man whose entire career has been built on the principle that the only good alien is a dead alien, abandoned his post and set out on a personal crusade to track down one specific orc. Not because it was strategically necessary, though he would have justified it that way if anyone had asked. Not because he was ordered to, because no one ordered Yaric to do anything he did not want to do, but because the bond between him and Gazgakul, the strange, violent, impossible bond that had grown between them over years of warfare, had become something he could not ignore. Yaric pursued Gazgakul for the same reason Gazgakul had released Yaric. Because the connection between them was more important than anything else, more important than duty or doctrine or the reasonable expectation that a human commissar should have better things to do than chase a single orc across the galaxy. This is the friendship. This is the bond that should not exist, but does. Not a friendship of warmth and affection, but a friendship of mutual recognition, of two warriors who see in each other the thing they respect most. For Gazgakul, Yaric is the ultimate challenge, the opponent who makes every fight worth having. It's the enemy whose existence gives meaning to his own martial existence. For Yaric, Gazgakul is the embodiment of everything he has spent his life fighting against, and the paradoxical truth that in fighting against it so completely, so passionately, he has become more connected to it than to almost anything else in his life. And the orc concept of the scumrod, the favorite enemy, is the framework that makes this relationship possible. It is a concept that has no real equivalent in human culture, a way of relating to an adversary that goes beyond hatred, beyond respect, into a territory that is uniquely orc. A scumrod is not just someone you fight. A scumrod is someone you need, someone whose existence enriches your own, someone whose death would diminish the galaxy in a way that no other loss could. When Gazgakul thinks of Yaric, he does not think, I must destroy that human. He thinks, that one is mine, and no one else gets to fight him. No one else gets to kill him. He is mine, and I am his, and this is the way it is supposed to be. That is not hatred. That is not enmity. In any language, in any culture, by any definition, that is a form of love. Now, I want to be careful here, because the idea of an orc feeling love is a tricky one. Orcs do not feel love in the human sense. They do not form romantic attachments. They do not experience the kind of deep emotional bonds that define human relationships. But the scumrod concept suggests that there is something in the orc psyche, something buried deep beneath the aggression and the violence and the bellowing, that is capable of recognizing and valuing another being in a way that transcends mere utility. It is not love as we understand it. It is something else, something alien and strange and wonderful in its own way, and a form of connection that can only exist between beings who have pushed each other to their absolute limits and found, in that extremity, something worth preserving. And this is where the blood axes come back into the picture. Because while the Gazgakul-Yaric relationship is the most famous example of an orc forming a bond with a human, the blood axes demonstrate that this capacity is not limited to a single exceptional individual. As the blood axes' entire cultural identity is built on the recognition that humans are worth interacting with, worth learning from, worth fighting alongside when the circumstances are right. They have served as mercenaries for the Imperium on multiple documented occasions, fighting alongside Imperial forces against common enemies and then going their separate ways when the job is done. And in those interactions, something that looks remarkably like mutual respect has developed, and a grudging acknowledgement on both sides that the other is not quite as bad as the propaganda would have you believe. The history of Bloodaxe mercenary work is one of the most fascinating and underexplored corners of Warhammer 40,000 lore. Consider the massacre at Big Torf River, one of the earliest recorded instances of Bloodaxe orcs fighting alongside Imperial forces. The details of this engagement are murky, and as the Imperium has a vested interest in suppressing any evidence that its forces have cooperated with aliens, but the broad outlines are clear. A Bloodaxe warband was contracted, through intermediaries, to assist Imperial forces in a campaign against a mutual enemy. The orcs fought with their characteristic ferocity, the Imperials fought with their characteristic discipline, and between them, the enemy was destroyed. When the battle was over, the Bloodaxes collected their payment, which consisted of weapons, ammunition, and a truly impressive quantity of teeth extracted from the casualties on both sides, and departed without incident. It was a clean, professional transaction, as businesslike as any contract between two human mercenary companies, and both sides walked away satisfied. Or consider the story of the Bloodaxe war boss Fragmaka, who I mentioned earlier, and his arrangement with an Imperial Inquisitor. This is a relationship that goes beyond simple mercenary work, and into something that can only be described as a political alliance, however informal and unofficial it might be. Fragmaka controls the orc world of Pexar, a planet that operates as a crude imitation of Imperial society, complete with trade relationships, diplomatic protocols, and a tacit agreement that the orcs will not attack Imperial shipping in exchange for being left alone and occasionally hired for the most dangerous and unpleasant jobs the Imperium has to offer. Imperial Chartist vessels are known to visit Pexar regularly, trading manufactured goods for the raw materials the orcs dig out of their planet's crust. Rogue traders dock in orbit to negotiate contracts for Bloodaxe services. Even Inquisitors, those most paranoid and xenophobic of Imperial agents, have been known to visit the world to contract orc mercenaries for operations so sensitive that no Imperial force can be trusted to carry them out. The arrangement works because both sides get something they want. The Imperium gets a deniable, expendable force of alien warriors who can be pointed at a problem and trusted to solve it with maximum violence and zero political complications. The Bloodaxes get what every orc wants, a steady supply of good fights, supplemented by a steady supply of weapons, equipment, and the raw materials of war. It is a relationship built on mutual exploitation, but as I said earlier, relationships built on mutual exploitation have a way of developing into something more. The Inquisitor who first negotiated the arrangement with Fragmaka reportedly kept one hand on his plasma pistol throughout the entire dinner meeting, but by the end, something that could perhaps be called understanding had formed between them, and not friendship, not trust, but an acknowledgement that the being across the table, however alien, however dangerous, however fundamentally different, was a being with whom business could be conducted. There are practical downsides to using orc mercenaries, of course. The most obvious is spore contamination. Orcs release spores constantly throughout their lives, tiny cellular structures that drift on the wind and bury themselves in the soil, eventually growing into new orcoid life forms. Bringing orcs to a planet that has not been previously infested means potentially seeding an entirely new orc population, one that will grow, multiply, and eventually become a threat in its own right. This is why the use of orc mercenaries is heavily regulated, confined to worlds that are already orc-infested, or to void-based operations where the spores can be contained and the ship thoroughly purified afterward. The second downside is the orcs' unpredictable pricing. One year, a mob of Bloodaxe commandos might demand a dozen plasma guns as payment. The next year, they might demand a Titan. The negotiation process is, to put it mildly, challenging. But for those Imperial agents willing to accept these risks, the rewards are significant. Blood Axe mercenaries are, first and foremost, superb fighters. Each one is a natural-born killing machine, bred for war at a cellular level, fearless, aggressive, and incredibly tough. They are also surprisingly reliable, as long as the payment is good and the fights are plentiful. And they offer something that no Imperial force can match: complete deniability. Orc mercenaries do not file reports. They do not testify before tribunals. They do not remember the details of operations they have participated in. And even if they did, no one in the Imperium would take the word of an orc seriously. For an inquisitor who needs a dirty job done with no witnesses and no paper trail, as a mob of Blood Axe orcs is the perfect tool. This broader pattern of Blood Axe interaction with the Imperium creates a cultural context that makes the Gazgakul and Yaric relationship less of an anomaly and more of an extreme expression of a pre-existing tendency. The Blood Axes have demonstrated, over centuries of mercenary work and trade, that orcs are capable of forming working relationships with humans. Oh, the scumrod bond between Gazgakul and Yaric is simply the most intense and most personal manifestation of this capacity. The point at which a transactional relationship between species becomes something deeper, something that transcends utility and enters the realm of genuine personal significance. There is a story from the lore about a Blood Axe war boss named Pragmatic, who negotiated an actual agreement with an Imperial Inquisitor. The two met, talked, and reached an understanding. Pragmatic would keep his orcs on their homeworld and not attack Imperial shipping. And in exchange, the Imperium would hire them for the best fights and would refrain from destroying their planet. The two sealed the deal over a dinner during which Pragmatic consumed several whole groks, including a live one that he insisted on fighting before eating. The Inquisitor kept one hand on his plasma pistol throughout the entire meal, but by the end, something that could perhaps be called an understanding had formed between them. Not friendship in the cozy, comfortable sense, but something real nonetheless. A mutual recognition that cooperation, however unnatural and uncomfortable it might be, was preferable to the alternative. This is the broader context in which the orc-human relationship exists. It is not a fairy tale. It is not a story about enemies putting aside their differences and discovering that they are actually the same deep down. Orcs and humans are not the same. They are profoundly, fundamentally different in ways that go beyond culture and ideology and into the very structure of their biology. But the fact that they can interact at all, the fact that there is a space, however narrow, however precarious, however fraught with the potential for betrayal and violence, as in which an orc and a human can recognize each other as something other than targets, is one of the most remarkable and underappreciated aspects of the Warhammer 40,000 lore. It challenges the narrative of absolute hatred that the Imperium relies upon. It suggests that the doctrine of suffer not the alien to live might be, if not wrong, then at least incomplete. It implies that the galaxy is more complex than the simple binary of us versus them, as that the categories of friend and foe are not as fixed and immutable as the High Lords of Terror would have their subjects believe. And it raises the deeply uncomfortable question of what other assumptions the Imperium might be wrong about, what other connections might be possible if the walls of hatred and fear were to come down even slightly. But of course, they will not come down. This is Warhammer 40,000, and in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. The friendship between Gazgakul and Yaric, the working relationships between Blood Axe mercenaries and Imperial officers, the moments of mutual respect and grudging admiration that flicker briefly between orc and human before being snuffed out by the next volley of bolter fire, these are not harbingers of a better future. They are anomalies, beautiful and tragic in equal measure, moments of impossible connection in a universe designed to prevent them. And perhaps that is what makes them so compelling. In a setting where hope is the rarest commodity, where every victory is temporary and every alliance is built on sand, the fact that two beings from opposite ends of the existential spectrum can find in each other something worth preserving, even if only for a moment, even if only through the medium of violence, is a kind of miracle. It is the Warhammer 40,000 equivalent of a flower growing through a crack in the concrete, a defiant assertion that even in the worst possible universe, connection is possible. The story of the orc who became friends with a space marine, or in this case a commissar who fights like a space marine, is not a story about overcoming differences. It is a story about transcending them, about two beings finding a wavelength on which they can communicate despite having no common language, no common culture, no common frame of reference beyond the fact that they both love a good fight. It is a story about the power of respect, about the recognition that your enemy can also be the thing that gives your life meaning. And it is a story about the strange, twisted, profoundly unhuman form of love that can grow in the most unlikely of soils. The love of one warrior for another, expressed not through words or gestures of affection, but through the only medium that both species truly understand: the clash of arms and the thunder of war. Yeah, the orcs have a saying that captures this better than any human language ever could. They say that a good fight is the only prayer worth offering to Gork and Mork. And in the case of Gazgakul and Yaric, the fight they have shared across decades of warfare, across the burning cities of Armageddon and the cold depths of space, across the gulf of species and culture and ideology that separates them. That fight is not just a prayer, it is a conversation. A dialogue conducted in the language of bolt shells and power claws, of strategic genius and brute force, of stubbornness and cunning, and the absolute refusal to give up. It is the longest, most violent, most destructive conversation in the history of the galaxy, and neither participant shows any sign of wanting it to end, because ending it would mean losing the thing that matters most, not the fight itself, though the fight matters, not the victory, though both sides want to win. But the connection, the recognition, the knowledge that somewhere out there, on the other side of the battlefield, there is someone who sees you, who understands what you are, who values you not, despite the threat you pose, but because of it. That is what Gazgakul and Yaric have found in each other. That is what makes their relationship the most unlikely and most beautiful friendship in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. Let me take you deeper into the implications of this relationship, because they extend far beyond the personal dynamic between two individuals. The Gazgakul-Yaric bond is a window into the soul of both species, a revealing glimpse of what orcs and humans are capable of when the normal rules of engagement are suspended, even briefly. It tells us something about the orcs that the standard law often glosses over, and it tells us something about humanity that the Imperium would rather not acknowledge. On the orc side, the scumrod concept reveals a depth of emotional complexity that contradicts the popular image of orcs as mindless brutes. Yes, orcs are violent. Yes, they are crude. Yes, their idea of a good time involves hitting things with other things until one of the things stops moving. But the fact that they can distinguish between a generic enemy and a special enemy, between a fight that is merely satisfying and a fight that is transcendent, and suggests that there is more going on inside those thick green skulls than most Imperial scholars give them credit for. The scumrod is proof that orcs are capable of something that looks remarkably like emotional attachment, however different it might be from the human version. They can form bonds. They can value relationships. They can recognize and appreciate qualities in other beings that go beyond simple strength or combatability. Yet the fact that these bonds are expressed through violence rather than affection does not make them any less real. It simply means they operate according to a different emotional grammar, one that is alien to human understanding, but perfectly logical within the orc worldview. This has profound implications for how we think about the orc species as a whole. If orcs are capable of forming scumrod bonds, of recognizing and valuing specific individuals across time and space, then they are not the mindless green horde that Imperial propaganda portrays them as. They are something more complex, more nuanced, more, dare I say it, interesting. They are beings with preferences, with relationships, with a capacity for something that, in the right light, from the right angle, with the right squint, looks an awful lot like love. On the human side, The Yaric-Gazgakul dynamic reveals something equally profound: the fact that even the most indoctrinated, most ideologically rigid human beings are capable of forming connections that violate their deepest held beliefs. Yaric is a commissar, a man whose entire identity is built on the principles of imperial orthodoxy. He has spent his entire life enforcing discipline, punishing weakness, and destroying the enemies of the emperor. He is, by any reasonable measure, a fanatic, a true believer in the imperial cause who would sooner die than compromise his principles. And yet, but when faced with an orc who embodies everything he is supposed to hate, he cannot help but feel a connection, a recognition, a bond that transcends ideology and speaks to something deeper and more fundamental in the human psyche. What does this tell us? It tells us that the human capacity for connection is stronger than any doctrine, more resilient than any conditioning, more stubborn than any ideology. It tells us that even in the grim darkness of the far future, where every aspect of human society is designed to suppress individuality and enforce conformity, the spark of genuine connection can still ignite in the most unexpected places. Yaric does not love Gazgakul in any conventional sense, but he recognizes him. He sees in the orc war boss something that resonates with his own nature, a warrior's spirit, a leader's charisma, a stubbornness that matches his own. And that recognition, that moment of seeing the self reflected in the other, that is the foundation of every relationship that has ever existed, from the simplest friendship to the most complex alliance. This is the subversive genius of the Gazgakul Yaric story. On the surface, it looks like a simple tale of military rivalry, a cat-and-mouse game between two commanders who keep running into each other on the battlefield. But beneath that surface, it is asking some of the most profound questions the Warhammer 40,000 universe has to offer. Can enemies be friends? As can hatred coexist with respect? Can connection survive in a universe designed to destroy it? And the answer, delivered not through philosophical discourse, but through the medium of bolt shells and power claws, is yes. Yes, it can. Not easily, not comfortably, not in a way that anyone involved would be willing to acknowledge openly. But yes, there is a moment in the lore that crystallizes this entire dynamic, that captures the essence of the Gazgakul Yaric relationship in a perfect image. It is the moment when Gazgakul, having captured Yaric at Golgotha, chooses to release him. Think about the scene. The greatest orc warlord in the galaxy, surrounded by his most loyal warriors, holding the one human who has caused him more trouble than any other. Every instinct, every tradition, every expectation of orc society says that he should kill Yaric, or at the very least keep him as a trophy, a symbol of his dominance over the humans. But Gazgakul does not do what he is supposed to do. He does what he wants to do, and what he wants is not to end the story, but to continue it. He wants the rivalry to go on, the fights to keep happening, the connection to endure. He releases Yaric because a galaxy without Yaric in it would be a lesser galaxy, a galaxy where the best fights are already in the past, a galaxy that has lost something precious and irreplaceable. And in that moment, and in that single act of impossible mercy from the most warlike being in the most warlike species in the galaxy, we see something that should not exist, but does. We see an orc choosing connection over destruction, relationship over victory, the joy of the future over the satisfaction of the present. We see, in the crudest and most violent possible form, an act of love. The universe of Warhammer 40,000 is a cruel place. It is a place where hope goes to die, where faith is rewarded with suffering, but where the only constant is the grinding, endless, soul-crushing reality of war without end. It is a place designed, from the ground up, to crush any attempt at connection, to punish any deviation from the script, to ensure that the only relationship between species is the relationship between predator and prey, between conqueror and conquered, between the living and the dead. And yet, in the space between bolt shells, in the silence between explosions, in the brief of flickering moments when the smoke clears, and two enemies find themselves staring at each other across the no-man's land of ideology and biology, and 60 million years of evolutionary divergence, something impossible happens. A bond forms. A connection is made. An orc sees a human and thinks, that one is special. That one I will keep. And a human sees an orc and thinks, I understand you. I do not know how, and I will never admit it, but I understand you. This is the story of the orc who became friends with a space marine. It is not a comfortable story. It does not fit neatly into the categories of good and evil, of hero and villain, of us and them. It is messy and violent and complicated and deeply, profoundly weird. But it is also beautiful, in the way that only the strangest and most unexpected things can be beautiful. It is a reminder that connection can survive in the harshest possible conditions, that the bonds between beings are more durable than the forces that seek to sever them, that even in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, there is also, impossibly, improbably, wonderfully, something that looks very much like friendship. The next time you look at an orc model on the tabletop, or read about a greenskin warband in the lore, or watch the green tide sweep across a battlefield in a game, remember this. Remember that beneath the crude armor and the bellowing war cries and the comically oversized weapons, there beats something that is not quite a heart, but serves the same purpose. There is a capacity for connection, for recognition, for the orc equivalent of love. It does not look like human love. It does not sound like it, or feel like it, or express itself in any way that a human would recognize. But it is there, buried deep in the genetic code that the old ones wrote 60 million years ago. As a tiny spark of something that goes beyond mere violence, beyond mere survival, beyond mere war, and sometimes, very rarely, in the most improbable of circumstances, that spark catches fire. And when it does, the galaxy is a slightly brighter place. Before we close out this story entirely, I want to touch on one more piece of orc lore that speaks to the incredible capacity of the greenskin spirit, as because it illuminates something about the orc psyche that is directly relevant to understanding how friendship is possible for this species. I want to talk about Tuska, the demon killer. Tuska was a war boss who, after his first encounter with demons during a routine planetary invasion, discovered that he absolutely loved fighting the servants of the Chaos Gods. Most species, upon encountering the nightmarish entities that pour out of the warp, experience soul-crushing terror, madness, and existential despair. Tuska experienced joy, pure, unadulterated, childlike joy at discovering an entirely new type of enemy to fight. He immediately turned his entire crusade around and pointed it directly at the Eye of Terror, the massive warp rift at the heart of the galaxy, where reality and the Imperium bleed together, and the Chaos Gods hold dominion. His followers thought he was mad. They were right. He was also having the time of his life. And Tuska and his horde plunged into the Eye of Terror, fighting their way through demon world after demon world, destroying everything in their path with the boundless enthusiasm of tourists visiting their favorite theme park. They fought bloodletters and plague bearers and daemonettes and horrors, and they loved every second of it. Eventually, inevitably, they were overwhelmed. The demonic hordes were endless, and even orcs have their limits. Tuska and his boys were slain to the last greenskin. But the story does not end there. Khorne, the chaos god of war, violence, and bloodshed, was watching, and Khorne was impressed. He was so impressed, in fact, that he claimed the souls of Tuska and his entire horde and transported them to his own domain within the warp, a realm of eternal battle where warriors fight and die and are reborn, with each blood-soaked dawn to fight again. Tuska and his boys now spend eternity fighting the greatest demonic champions of Khorne's own legions, are dying and being resurrected each morning to do it all again. For the orcs, it is paradise. For Khorne, it is entertainment. For anyone paying attention, It is proof that the orc's spirit is so powerful, so fundamentally aligned with the nature of combat, that even the gods of chaos themselves cannot help but be impressed by it. This story matters to our larger discussion because it demonstrates something crucial about the orc capacity for connection. Khorne, as a being of cosmic power and unimaginable cruelty, looked at Tusker and his boys and saw something worth keeping. A god of war recognized in the orcs a kindred spirit, a being whose love of combat was so pure and so absolute that it transcended the boundaries between the materium and the immaterium. If even a chaos god can form a kind of bond with an orc, a relationship based on mutual appreciation of the art of warfare, then the friendship between Gazgakul and Yaric seems slightly less impossible. It is part of a broader pattern, a recognition that the orc love of a good fight creates connections that bridge even the most unbridgeable gaps, whether those gaps are between species, between factions, or between the mortal realm and the domain of the gods themselves. The orcs also believe in an afterlife of their own, a concept known as the Great Green. When an orc dies a good death, his spirit is said to journey to the Great Green, a realm of endless fighting and feasting, where the greatest orc warriors gather to share stories and crack skulls for all eternity. It is a simple belief, uncomplicated by the philosophical anxieties that plague human religion, and it speaks to the fundamental optimism of the orc species. Even death is not an ending for an orc. It is simply a transition from one set of fights to another. And if the fights in the Great Green are even half as good as the ones in the mortal world, then death is nothing to be feared and everything to be welcomed when it comes on the right terms. This belief in the Great Green also contextualizes the scumrod concept in an interesting way. If an orc believes that the spirits of the greatest warriors persist after death, then a scumrod is not just someone you keep alive for better fights in the present. A scumrod is someone you want to meet again in the Great Green, someone whose spirit is worthy of the eternal battlefield, someone you want fighting beside you or against you forever. The bond transcends mortality. It is, in its own crude, green-skinned way, a belief in the eternal nature of a connection forged in combat, a conviction that the best relationships do not end with death, but continue on the other side in an ever-escalating series of legendary brawls. That, my friends, is the story of the orc who became friends with a space marine in Warhammer 40,000. It is a story about war and friendship, about hatred and respect, about the barriers that separate us and the connections that transcend them. It is a story that reminds us that even in the darkest universe imaginable, the most fundamental truth of all still holds. We need each other, even when we are trying to kill each other. Even when every instinct says to hate and destroy and fear, we need the connection. But the recognition, the bond, we need our scumrod. And maybe that is the real lesson of this story, the thing that makes it resonate beyond the confines of the Warhammer 40,000 setting and into something more universally meaningful. Because the truth is, we all have scumrods in our lives. We all have people who challenge us, who push us to be better, who refuse to let us be comfortable or complacent or satisfied with mediocrity. They are not always pleasant people. They do not always make us happy in the conventional sense, but they make us more than we would be without them, and that is a form of love that deserves recognition, even if it comes wrapped in green skin and smells faintly of motor oil and fungus beer. The galaxy of Warhammer 40,000 is a mirror, distorted and exaggerated, but a mirror nonetheless, reflecting back at us the most extreme versions of our own tendencies, our own fears, our own capacity for both destruction and connection. When we look at the Imperium of man, we see the logical endpoint of xenophobia taken to its absolute extreme, a civilization so consumed by fear and hatred of the other that it has destroyed any possibility of alliance, cooperation, or mutual understanding. When we look at the orcs, we see the logical endpoint of a species designed purely for conflict, a race so perfectly adapted to warfare that they have lost the ability to do anything else. And when we look at the relationship between Gazgakul and Yaric, we see something that transcends both extremes, a bond that exists in the narrow, precarious space between total war and total isolation, proving that even the most rigid systems, even the most unyielding ideologies, even the most deeply programmed behaviors can be disrupted by the simple, stubborn, ineradicable desire to connect with another being. There is an old saying that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. In the case of Gazgakul and Yaric, the saying needs to be updated. The enemy of my everything is my everything. Gazgakul does not need Yaric as an ally. He needs him as an opponent, as a challenge, as a reason to keep getting out of bed in the morning, or whatever the orc equivalent of bed is, probably a pile of ammunition and half-eaten squig. And Yaric does not need Gazgakul as a friend. He needs him as a purpose, as a mission, as the defining challenge of his life, around which everything else orbits like planets around a star. They complete each other in a way that neither would ever admit. And in doing so, they create something that is greater than the sum of its parts. A story that speaks to the fundamental human, and perhaps orcish, need to find meaning through engagement with the other. Consider what would happen if Gazgakul actually succeeded in killing Yaric. He would win. He would achieve the victory he has been chasing for decades. And then what? Then the fight is over. Then the story is finished. Then the galaxy becomes a slightly less interesting place. A place where the best opponent is gone, and every future fight will be measured against the one that can never happen again and found wanting. Gazgakul knows this, whether consciously or instinctively, and it is why he has never made a serious, committed attempt to permanently eliminate Yaric. The pursuit is more valuable than the capture. The chase is more thrilling than the catch. The relationship, violent and destructive as it is more precious than any possible conclusion. And the same is true for Yaric. If he were to finally destroy Gazgakul, he would fulfill his oath, complete his mission, and earn himself a place in the halls of Imperial legend. But he would also lose the thing that has defined his life for decades, the adversary who has given his existence a focus and an intensity that nothing else can match. Yaric without Gazgakul would be like a blade without something to cut, technically still a blade, but fundamentally incomplete. The two of them need each other, not despite the fact that they are enemies, but because of it. Their enmity is their bond, their war is their love language, and their mutual refusal to give up is the foundation upon which their impossible friendship is built. I want to take a moment to reflect on what this tells us about the nature of connection itself, because the Gazgakul-Yaric dynamic is not just a quirky piece of Warhammer 40,000 lore. It is a commentary on one of the most fundamental aspects of conscious existence, the need to be seen. Gazgakul sees Yaric, not as a target, not as an obstacle, not as a representative of a hated enemy species, but as a specific individual with specific qualities that Gazgakul recognizes and values. And Yaric sees Gazgakul not as just another orc, not as a generic alien threat to be neutralized, but as a unique being with a unique personality and a unique set of abilities that command his respect. In a galaxy where individuals are crushed beneath the weight of faction, species, and ideology, where the individual is nothing and the group is everything, these two beings have achieved something extraordinary. They have seen each other as individuals, and in that seeing, in that recognition, they have created a bond that is stronger than any doctrine, any conditioning, any biological imperative. This is why the story endures. This is why, among all the grand narratives of Warhammer 40,000, the galactic wars, the fallen empires, the cosmic horrors, and the divine betrayals, the simple story of an orc who thought a human was too good to kill resonates with people because it speaks to something universal, or something that transcends the specifics of the setting and touches on the most basic truth of conscious existence. We need to be seen, we need to be recognized, we need to know that somewhere out there, someone knows who we are, what we are capable of, and thinks that we matter. Even if that someone is a 7-foot-tall, green-skinned alien who communicates primarily through the medium of high-velocity projectiles. Let me paint one more picture for you. One more image to carry with you as we reach the end of this story. Imagine the surface of Armageddon during the Third War. Imagine the sky dark with smoke and the ground trembling with the impact of artillery. Imagine the endless columns of green-skinned warriors pouring across the landscape like a living tide, their war cries rising into the ashen air like a hymn to violence itself. And imagine, somewhere in that chaos, two figures, one human, one orc, locked in their eternal dance of war. They are surrounded by millions of combatants, engulfed in a conflict that spans an entire planet. But in this moment, they might as well be the only two beings in the galaxy, because for each of them, the other is the only one that truly matters. That is the friendship, that is the bond, that is the strange, violent, beautiful, impossible thing that grew in the cracks of a universe designed to prevent it. Not a friendship of peace and harmony, but a friendship of fire and fury. Us of two spirits who found in each other something that nothing else in the galaxy could provide. There is one final thought I want to leave you with. The Old Ones, those ancient beings who created the orcs 60 million years ago, designed them for war. They encoded aggression into every cell, violence into every instinct, the love of combat into every fiber of the orc being. But in doing so, perhaps without intending to, they also encoded something else. They encoded the capacity for recognition, for appreciation, for the ability to look at another being and see not just an enemy, but a worthy one. They built into the orc psyche the ability to distinguish between a fight that is merely adequate and a fight that is transcendent, between an opponent who is merely dangerous and an opponent who is magnificent. And in that distinction, in that ability to see and value the quality of the other, there lies the seed of everything that makes the Gazgakul and Yaric relationship possible. The Old Ones built the orcs for war, but in building them for war, they accidentally built them for something else as well. They built them for connection. Because you cannot truly appreciate a fight without appreciating the fighter, and you cannot truly value a warrior without, on some level, valuing the being behind the weapon. The scumrod concept is not a bug in the orc programming. It is a feature, an inevitable consequence of creating a species that finds meaning through combat. If you make a being that lives for the fight, you have also made a being that can love the fighter, and that love, crude and violent and alien as it is the crack through which friendship slips into a universe that was never designed to accommodate it. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the most fascinating corners of Warhammer 40,000 lore, do me a favor and hit that like button. It helps the channel more than you know, and it tells the algorithm that there are people out there who want to hear stories like this. If you want more content like this, hit subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a new video. I have got so many more stories to tell, so many more corners of this incredible universe to explore, and I want to take you along for the ride. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, even the most impossible friendships can bloom. Until next time, take care of yourselves.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.